Now, Dr. Kirkwood.
This is our third class on the series of Answering Atheism. Appreciate everyone being here. And just a few comments before we begin. First of all, we appreciate those that are on YouTube that are watching these videos. We have quite a few that are watching the videos, and we appreciate those that continue to watch. Appreciate the comments that they've sent in. We've had some good, interesting comments, constructive criticism, you might say, regarding these lessons, and we certainly appreciate those that take the effort to do that and invite you to continue to do it. There will be a 2-week break in our class, if I'm doing my mathematics correct here, because next week is there's our singing, first Wednesday of the month, and then we have our gospel meeting the next Wednesday. So if you're looking at these classes on YouTube, there will be a little bit of a break before you'll get another one. And speaking of bad mathematics, last week it was brought to my attention by Brother Chris Vestelica that I had made, or there was a discrepancy in my slide, and I'm curious why no one else saw that, but he certainly saw it. It was the slide that had to do with how fast are you moving. You remember that slide? We talked about the rotation of the Earth and the orbit of the Earth, and I said that you're moving at about 1.9 million miles per hour, but I left off an interesting slide that should have been on there. There was a slide that the solar system is moving through the galaxy at 483,000 miles per hour. If you did the math before, it'd come out to about 1.3. Now it comes out to 1,893,000, which is very close to the 1.9 million I quoted. The point of that slide really wasn't how fast you're moving through the universe or how fast you're moving as you're sitting in your chair, but just to show how God's laws, both gravity and relativity, pertain to that, so that you can be moving at 1.9 and not feel it, 1.9 million miles per hour. But there was a discrepancy in the math, and it wasn't intentional. And it was nobody's fault but my own, and I left that important part of that slide out. So we have corrected it for future lectures, but wanted to point that out. So tonight we're going to take another approach. I call it the philosophical argument. You might call it the logical argument. I don't know what, you may come up with some other terms, but we're going to, as you know, in our quest to deal with atheism, we are trying to convince the atheist, first of all, that there's a God. At least, it's going to be hard to talk about Jesus Christ before you can prove that there is a God to begin with. And so that's where I begin. Again, I said in my very first class, this is my approach. It doesn't have to be your approach, but it's certainly an approach, and one that I think is a logical approach to trying to convince the atheist to become a Christian. And the first place you're going to have to start is convincing them that there is a God. So in order to do that, I am going to take an approach tonight I would call the logical or the philosophical approach, and not go straight to the Bible. We'll do that later on once we establish that there's a God. And this isn't a very important, I think, lesson. One of the most important that we're going to deal with is tonight's. And it's very simple, and again, it doesn't take a PhD in philosophy to understand this stuff. It's as simple as it gets, and you'll see as we go through the lesson what I'm talking about. If you read the lesson beforehand, you understand that. So that's our approach tonight. But there's a couple of ground rules that first of all we have to agree with when we're talking to our atheist friends. And these ground rules that have to be there are these arguments don't work. They just don't work. And that is, first of all, that truth is knowable. There isn't all this stuff about truth is relative. Truth is not relative. If you don't believe me, then get on a building and jump from it and see if you float down. There's a truth to gravity, right? You know, if I drop a pencil here, it's going to fall to the ground. 2 + 2 = 4. If you can't agree on 2 + 2 = 4, you're not going to be able to agree on anything as far as this lesson is concerned. So there is truth that is knowable. It's not relative. Now we can disagree on what that truth is, and that's the whole point of these lessons in essence. So you may not agree with what I think is the truth, and you may not agree with me, and I may not agree with you, but the point is there is a truth and it is knowable. And the second thing, which should be painfully obvious, and that is the opposite of true is false. If you show something to be emphatically true, then anything else that's contrary to that is false. In our particular lessons, you cannot believe in God and not believe in God. They are diametrically opposed to each other. So there either is a God or there is not. I don't know of anything else in between. Do you? I mean, I can't think of anything else in between. It's either pure materialism or there is a God. Now, we might differ on the concept of that God, but tonight we're dealing with the concept, is there a God? We'll get to the God of the Old Testament and New Testament in later lessons. But the opposite of truth has to be false. Men, believe it or not, and some materialists would deny that there's logic. And then there's some Eastern religions that deny that there's logic. So, but you have to, for these lessons to make sense. So logic does exist. And the simple logic that we're going to use tonight is called deductive reasoning. And it's the most basic as you can get. And I show here one of the examples that I've read before about how to look at deductive reasoning. And we use this reasoning all the time. When we're reading our Bibles, we use deductive reasoning to determine what's scripturally right to do and what's scripturally wrong to do, don't we? We use reasoning. We have to. Paul used reasoning. We pointed that out in our first lesson. But this is the major premise. All men are mortal. The minor premise, Socrates was a man. What can you deduce by those two premises, the major and the minor premise? Well, the conclusion is Socrates was mortal as a result of that. If all men are mortal, and Socrates was a man, and all men are mortal, then Socrates had to be mortal, i.e. he died. He's not still living. That's fairly simplistic deductive reasoning, but again, it's very important to set this up in order to try to convince the gainsayer and convince them that there's a God. Now, there's another type of reasoning. I didn't put it in your lesson or in this slide, but there's the abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is reasoning that a lot of evolutionists use, and to me, it's flawed reasoning. It goes something like this, and I'll just give an example to show what I mean. Trees fall down due to hurricanes and strong winds. That's premise number one. Premise number two, I come up upon a field where trees have fallen down. Logic, a hurricane took those trees down. Do you see a problem with that logic? Yeah, it could have been something else, but you've eliminated that something else with that kind of reasoning. So we will stay away from abductive reasoning in this class. We are going to use simple deductive reasoning. And here's the number one thought that we're going to talk about today. It's very important. And I think it's one of the strongest reasons for proving there's a God, and it's very hard to refute. Very hard to refute. And it's often called the cosmological argument. Don't have to remember what the argument is called. This argument really came from a Muslim named Kalam, K-A-L-A-M. It's a Muslim concept, but it's still, they're proving a God, different God than you and I believe in, but still the argument is there for a God. And that is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Think of something in the universe, something in your life, something that you have knowledge of that began to exist. And if it began to exist, it had a cause. I don't know of any other way of putting it other than that. If something begins to exist, it had a cause. When a baby's born, there was a cause for that baby being born. Something had to start that process. That's a crude example, but it's a good example. Something that begins has to have a cause. That's how we interact with life. The universe had a beginning. It began to exist. And we're going to prove that in just a minute. Therefore, the logical conclusion is the universe had a cause. Something caused the universe to occur, to begin, if it had a beginning. So, what will the atheist or the materialist then have to say about this argument? Well, one of the things they would have to say they would have to, for this argument to hold water, our atheist friends are going to have to acknowledge that the universe had a beginning. Now, we can read in our Old Testament that how God created the universe and everything that's in it, the heavens and the earth and everything's in it. We know it had a beginning. We know it began by the words of God. Now, the materialists, are they going to agree with that? They're not going to agree with the cause, but most of them will agree that the universe had a beginning. And why would they agree with that? Because the evidence is just so certain that there had to be a beginning. I mean, the evidence is there. There was a beginning of the universe. Now, there was a time when the materialists did not believe that, and it hadn't been all that long ago. Back in the middle part of the 20th century, back in the 1940s and 1950s, there was this idea of the steady state universe, What was the steady state universe? The steady state universe was the concept that the universe has always existed. It's always been there. So you didn't need a beginning if it had always been there. But with scientific studies now, not through creationists, not through Christians, but through scientific studies, in their mind now they understand that the universe had to have had a beginning. Where did this come from? In fact, there's an interesting anecdotal story about Einstein going to the Hubble telescope and talking with the scientists there. And Hubble was there apparently. And after what Einstein saw at the Hubble telescope laboratory was that indeed, he was quoted as, "Indeed, I understand there has to be a beginning." So why is that? And what did the Hubble telescope see that caused Einstein to understand that there was a beginning? They saw something called the Doppler effect. Any of you familiar with the Doppler effect? I'm sure there are some scientists in the audience that are familiar with the Doppler effect. So by looking at the Doppler effect and the different colors of the galaxies and objects in the universe through this enormous telescope, Hubble was able to see that there was a red color. And red in the Doppler effect shows that things are moving away from you. So the Doppler effect showed that what was happening with the universe is that it was expanding. Now, if you had a steady state universe, it would not be expanding. It would just not be. That's steady state universe. It would be just there, static, wouldn't be expanding. So when Einstein and then the scientists that understand the importance of what was found by this Doppler effect, when they saw this, they began to understand there had to be a beginning to the universe. So the scientists believe now, really no reputable scientist believes in the steady state universe anymore. But for many, many, many years, that was what was accepted by scientists. That was the predominant theory amongst scientists. But we know that's not true. And one way we know that's not true is through the Doppler effect. So this is one of the points that I like to bring out. When you see true science doesn't contradict the Bible. It just doesn't. But science can be wrong. And when science is wrong, it can contradict the Bible. The Bible's always going to be right, even though it's not a book of science. Well, does the Bible talk about the expanding universe that we see in the Doppler effect? Well, some people think it does. There's at least 5 different authors, beginning in the Psalms: Job, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah. For example, Psalm 104 verse 2 talks about the stretching out of the heavens like a curtain. That could certainly imply that the universe is expanding. Job 9:8 says, "He," that's God alone, "spreads out the heavens." This spreading out, this stretching out could certainly indicate that the Bible is talking about an expanding universe. So I think it's a biblical concept. And like I say, there are 10 different verses that I looked up that talk about this stretching out like a curtain, and God alone does that. Those verses clearly show that God alone does that. But is that the only thing that would explain this beginning of the universe, that is this Doppler effect, this expanding of the universe? No, that's not true. But first of all, Alan Guth, who's a cosmologic physicist, he understands that an expanding universe mandates a beginning. So now we're going back to our premise. For something to begin, it had to have a cause. Now, Guth doesn't say it has a cause, but he understands the universe had to have a beginning. But here's the other thing. You remember last week we talked about God's laws. And the reason you think I brought those up just to show that I know what they were, but they are applicable to our class. And that is the eternal universe would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy, which says that disorder is increasing. How would that violate the idea that the universe has a beginning or doesn't have a beginning? Well, yeah, if it was eternal, think about it. If the universe was eternal and the thermodynamics is true, as far as we know, the second law of thermodynamics is true. No experiment has ever been shown that the second law, the meta law that we have of second law of thermodynamics is not true. All the studies we know says that it is true. We've never seen anything violate this meta principle. But if the universe was eternal, it would have died already because of entropy. It would have died a thermal death, and we wouldn't be here. So if nothing else, This law shows that the universe cannot be eternal. It had a beginning, had to. You understand what you grasp that concept? It's a real simple thing. So those two things alone, the evidence is that the universe is expanding, therefore it had a beginning, and the fact that we are here shows that it did not violate this second law of thermodynamics. It could not be eternal. So as entropy increased, the universe would die a thermal death. So to me, it's absolute proof. The universe had to have a beginning. And again, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The beginning of what? The beginning of everything. The beginning of everything. Time, space, matter, all of that began. Space, think about this. Space. We think about space. Space is outer space. Space is the stars and the galaxies. No, space is space. The room we're in here right now is space. That had to be created. May not ever think about that, but it did. The concept of space had to be created. Matter, the heavens and the earth, space and matter, those had to be created, and they were created in a point in time. That's what the Bible says. So what was before then? God. That's all we know, God in his existence. But space, time, matter, all had a very beginning. And even the Big Bang postulates believe that, but they believe it come from a different type of beginning. So, if there was a cause, let's establish now that whatever begins has to have a cause. What would that cause look like? What do you think it would look like? Well, this is what William Craig says, and I agree with him. The cause would have to transcend time and space. It would have to be something that transcends this time that had to be created and this space that had to be created and the matter, of course. It would have to transcend that. It would have to be more than that. So when the Big Bang theorist says that it starts with quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, no, that doesn't transcend time and space. That's something that would have to be eternal, and we've already established that the universe is not eternal, and the things in it are not eternal. This cause would have to be changeless and immaterial without cause. So the cause would have to be without cause, and that's what gets the atheist, I think, in trouble there too. They don't understand the concept of God. Well, then they want to ask what causes God. We have a slide that deals with that in just a minute. They don't understand that the cause that would cause the universe to come into being would have to be material, and itself would have to be without cause. Nothing caused God. God was just God, or is God. This cause would have to be unimaginably powerful, obviously. It would have to be something that was so powerful in its intellect and powerful in what it could do that it would be unimaginable, that we can't comprehend that. The fourth thing, it had to be plausibly personal. Plausibly personal. Now that's something we have to prove down the road, and we will, I think. But plausibly personal. If there is a cause, that cause God could let us know about it. He could communicate that to us in the future after he demonstrated that. It could be plausibly personal and obviously of supreme intellect. Supremely intellect, beyond our wildest imagination. And here's the problem. Material things, not a problem, but it should be obvious. Material things cannot cause anything. Intellect causes something, but material things don't cause anything. A molecule is a molecule. It doesn't cause anything. A boson is a boson. It doesn't cause anything. And William Craig would say, now, the cause was eternal. The effect it causes not. This universe is going to be destroyed, and there's plenty of verses in the Bible that deal with that. We won't have time to turn to those. But the cause was eternal. The effect it caused is not. What's the answer to this? What does the materialist, how do they answer the argument against a cause? Their answer, if you've watched my initial video to kind of set this class up a little bit, you may know this answer now. It's the multiverse. The multiverse explains everything to the materialist. Now, what is the multiverse? Multiverse is the concept that, okay, the universe didn't have a beginning, and the reason it didn't have a beginning is because there are a multitude of universes. There is an infinite number of universes. But that really begs the question, doesn't it? What is the mechanism that those multi-universes came into being? So that's one answer that they give. It is a cop-out. It is not a very good answer, but it is an answer to this question of what has a beginning has to have a cause. And they would say, well, it's been infinite. That goes back to the steady state, really. Now you're saying all universes are basically a steady state, and it doesn't fit the scientific facts. And the other cause that is listed sometimes by the materialist is the idea of oscillating universes. So, yeah, okay, the universe is expanding, it had a beginning, but when it gets to that time when thermal death occurs, then it's going to contract on itself. So now you have the concept of big bang, big crunch, big bang, big crunch, oscillating like that. So first of all, the argument against that is there no scientific evidence for that? And it goes back to the same question. Well, when did the very first one begin? What caused that one? And the mechanism that would cause an oscillating universe would be it would require so much fine-tuning that it's very, very unlikely to occur. How about the moral argument? The moral argument says, if God does not exist, objective values and duties do not exist. Objective values, that should be values and morals, not orals, sorry about that. Objective morals and values do exist. Therefore, God exists. So, does that sound reasonable to you too? If God did not exist, we would not have values, duties. We just wouldn't have them. Well, we do have them. And only the most outrageous atheist would deny this. Only the most outrageous atheist would deny that values exist. But guess what? There's some that do agree with that. Our friend, and we're going to see a slide here in a minute from Nietzsche, but someone even more relevant, or not relevant, but relevant to our time, Richard Dawkins says, there is no good, there's no evil, just pitiable indifference. What a sad commentary on life, I think. Just pitiable indifference is all there is. But we do have morals, we have values. That's why we have laws in various countries and so forth. Craig Thomas, a preacher of the gospel, remember the church, says there is a moral nature in man and there is a moral order within the universe. And we just see that. We see that morality does exist. Now, granted, it seems like nowadays our morality is not what it ought to be and what it used to be, but there is still morality within the universe. A.E. Taylor wrote, man draws the line between right and wrong in a different place, but at least they all agree there is such a line to be drawn. And then finally, I think this is scriptural as well. If we look at Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 16, the Gentiles had a law. They were not without law. They had a law. Wasn't the law of Moses, but verse 14 says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are law to themselves. What does that mean, a law by nature? I think it's that moral law. I mean, there was law before the law of Moses. Cain killed Abel. That wasn't right. How did Cain know not to kill Abel? I think there was moral law there that God had given. And these things come from a higher being. And I believe that is a very powerful argument that says there has to be a God. Josh Gertler, man is the only creature that has ever held an innate sense of right and wrong, otherwise known as morality. We don't see that in animals. Animals don't get guilty over killing another animal or stealing another animal's food. Just look at your dogs or your cats or whatever, and you can see that. They don't get guilty over that. But it is universally accepted amongst civilization that it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to steal, rape, swindle, or abuse one's fellow man. Even atheists will use such descriptions as right or wrong, good or bad, we should or should not, we ought or ought not. They'll still use those words. Where do they get those words? And like I said last week in my lesson, some of the atheists are very moral people, which is a contradiction, it seems like to me, because it doesn't make sense. But where did their morality come from is what I would like to know. And you will see things like good and bad. I mean, otherwise, how do we condemn people like Jeffrey Epstein? Who Jeffrey Epstein is. Jeffrey Epstein, the fellow that has was taking young women to take advantage of them, multi-millionaire. Well, guess what? It turns out Jeffrey Epstein was a contributor to a lot of Darwinists and sent a lot of money to schools that were supporting that type of thought. And a lot of the professors that he supported even knew about it and wouldn't say a word about it. So, if there is no moral law, then everything is survival of the fittest. Every man for himself. Might makes right, and morals are always situational. And there are the pure materialists that would agree with all those things. But that's not what we see. We see in our society there is some moral laws, and that would indicate to me a higher being. Again, Friedrich Nietzsche. Morality is a hindrance to the development of new and better customs. An absurd quote to me, an absurd quote. A hindrance. Third argument. And this argument is the argument that we will spend more time with, and it's called the Teleological Argument. And it has to do with design and purpose. And so other lessons we will use this argument in a little bit more depth than we're going to tonight. But it's a pretty important argument. And that is the fine-tuning of the universe due to physical necessity, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design. There's no other possibilities that I know of. So, once again, the fine-tuning, and not too many people will disagree that the universe is fine-tuned. I don't know of anybody really that would disagree with that. It's fine-tuned. You can disagree on how or why it's fine-tuned, but they're not going to disagree with the fine-tuning per se. So that fine-tuning in the universe has to be due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Those are your three possibilities. Physical necessity means it has to be that way. That would be like saying DNA had no other way of coming about except it had to be that way. It was a physical necessity. That's just one example. We know that physical necessity and chance does not explain the fine-tuning of the universe. It just does not. Therefore, it has to be due to design, and it is due to design. There's no physical necessity for the universe, and the fine-tuning, the degree of fine-tuning that we see. And chance is a we've talked about this also in our first class, chance cannot cause anything. Chance is chance. What's the likelihood of something occurring by chance? That's what we're going to look at. Hugh Ross, who is an astrophysicist, a Christian astrophysicist, he's looked at about 37 different constants and laws and so forth, and he says the universe is fine-tuned to 10 to the 37th power. That's an astronomical number. It's a number that you and I cannot even comprehend. It is essentially zero. What are these forces or constants? First, there's the strong nuclear force, the force that causes atoms to stick together. The protons, neutrons inside of the atom. Then there's the weak nuclear force, causes the electron to stay together. Gravitational constant, the speed of light. The polarity of water, very important, the polarity of water. You never think about that, but there's a multitude of these, and 10 to the 37th power. Fred Hoyle has said, it seems as if a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as the chemistry and biology. Paul Davies says the impression of design is overwhelming when you look at our universe and life within the universe. And this comes from an MIT physicist, Vera Kisiowski, and that is the exquisite order displayed by our scientific understanding of the physical world calls for a divine. It shouts for a divine. Of course, that's a biblical concept as well, as we see in the book of Romans. Even Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, it would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way, except as the act of God who intended to create beings like us. Now, Stephen Hawking wasn't a believer in God. He's just saying it would be difficult. Okay? He's just saying it would be very difficult to explain it, but yet he goes on to explain it. So it's a difficult explanation, but they have one. And again, a lot of it has to do with this multi-universe stuff, and we won't belabor that too much. In my book, The Evolution Delusion, I have this quote from, or not quote, but this example from William Dembski. William Dembski is a PhD in mathematics. He's also a part of the intelligent design community that's out of Seattle, Washington. And he's got, here we go with the logic again. But this is his premise. Life has occurred. Would anybody disagree with that? Only the really people far out would disagree with life has occurred. I guess some of these philosophers might go that deep, but not any logical thinking person. Life is specified. Who would disagree with that? Nobody would disagree with that. Life is very specified. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for DNA and the molecules that make up DNA and so forth, and the information that's in DNA. It has to be specified. So here we go again. Life is either due to chance, and if it is chance, then life has a very small probability, and we're going to look at that probability in just a minute. So chance is a very poor explanation for life. Life is not due to regularity. That's that word kind of necessity that we look like at the universe. Life did not have to come about. It's not due to a regularity in chemicals and structures such as the chemical structures in life. So life then must be due to either regularity, chance, or design. Conclusion, you can wipe out irregularity, that ain't the cause. You can wipe out chance, it's so improbable. Life has to be due to by design. And so what he came up with, William Dembski, was this universal probability bound, and look at that number. That's 10 to the 155th power. So if you thought 10 to the 37th power was high, look at that number. So how did he come about? He's a mathematician, okay? And y'all don't get on me if this math isn't correct. I'm taking this from William Dembski, not me, okay? And so he used 10 to the 80th power in the universe. He used 10 to the 45th power as seconds it takes for properties of matter to transition from one physical matter to another, and 10 to the 25th as the number of seconds in the universe. He's even accepting the materialist view that the universe is 20. He used 20 billion years, but I think now they don't think it's quite that old. Now I think it's 13.7, and who knows what they really think now because they've lowered that number recently. But the point is, it's extremely unlikely that life would occur due to chance. And that's what this is. This is the likelihood of life occurring by chance. And again, I'm not going to belabor this. We've already looked at it. The multi-universe concept is impossibly confused, and it's just a cop-out. The oscillating universe still begs the question. And then again, who designed the designer? Infinite regress. You know what an infinite regress is? Anybody know what that is?
Keep backing something up.
Yeah, and you never get to an end, yeah. It's kind of like a mirror looking in a mirror, looking in a mirror, looking in a mirror, that kind of thing. Well, if you think about it, the argument, well, what caused God? If you answer that, well, God, there was another God that caused God. Well, who caused that God? Well, there was another God that caused that God. Caused that God that caused God. Do you see what I'm saying? It would be an infinite regress. And actually, the materialists will use this as an argument against God. But again, to me, they don't understand God. They don't understand the concept of God. So infinite regress is an argument to me against the materialist, not for the materialist. Now, there are other arguments too. We don't have time tonight to go through these. I would recommend, and I should have brought it tonight, Josh Gertler has an excellent workbook on these subjects, and if I can remember, I'll bring that to the next lesson. He talks about other arguments as well, and so does Craig Thomas, for that matter, in a work that he did. But there is the ontological argument, and that is the concept of a God is proof of God. Now, to me, these are weaker arguments. I like the cosmological argument, the moral argument, and I like the teleological arguments pretty well. They're pretty ironclad. These are still arguments. There's some validity to them, but the fact that there is a concept of a God is a proof of a God. And if you look at societies around, and that kind of goes into number 2 there, and that's the universal belief argument. There's hardly any society, I don't know of any society that's ever existed that doesn't have some concept of a higher being. And so that is an argument. And then there's the esthetical argument. Now, the esthetical argument is a little bit like the teleological argument, but not so much about purpose. It's looking at the beauty of things. And so those are other arguments. And we'll look at a few of these a little bit more in detail, and we'll really get into that teleological argument as we go along with our course to look at how unlikely life could ever begin by chance. So you have 2 choices. You can either be by chance or by design. Necessity is not an option. Which one is more plausible? And I would look at Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4. This is, I think, an argument for the design argument. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. Just looking at the heavens, you can see so much knowledge that had to be there to be created. There is no speech nor language. Where their voice is not heard, their line has gone out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. in them he has set a tabernacle for the sun. So I think the design argument is part of God's argument for existence too. So really, again, to me, pretty simplistic. What has a beginning has to have a cause. And you're going to have to, as a materialist, answer that question. And they can't. They can't. They used to say matter always existed. They don't say that anymore. They say that matter was created through, again, quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, but they can't explain where quantum fluctuations in a vacuum come through. So it's really the same point. They cannot do that. So they have to have something that exists before. So if you look at it from that point of view, they have something. They have a God of their own. It's quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, because that's all they have. So they have something, but that's not all powerful. It's not omniscient. It's not universally intellectual, as we would say. But anyway, they have to have something as well. But they're just not going to call it God. Anybody else? So we'll have a 2-week break. Lesson 4 is out there. If you didn't have lesson 3, there's a few more of those out there still. When we start our next series of lessons, we're going to be looking at how would an explanation of how life began from nothing occur. And if you have time to look at it, I will refer you to a few videos during this class, but James Tour, T-O-U-R, he's a Rice professor. He's a nanotechnology scientist. He's not a biologist per se. He's a chemist. He's a pure chemist. He's got like 7 or 8 different patents underneath him. Very brilliant man. He has an excellent lecture there on, and he doesn't write anything. So you're not going to find a book by James Tour. He's not a writer. And he's a pure scientist. He does science. He does not do evolution. He doesn't do creation. He is a pure science. But he's looked at the likelihood of life occurring by just a molecular process, and he understands it's virtually zero. Very good lecture if you want to hear that. We're going to be talking about that, though, in our next class, and we'll be looking at that argument. And the second thing that's in your handout, we're going to be looking at this idea of, is there a difference between the mind and the brain? You know, if you're a materialist, all there can be is the brain. Molecules bumping into molecules, basically. But is there a difference? Is there scientific evidence that there's a difference between mind and brain? And I will tell you, as a little teaser, there is. There is quite a bit of scientific evidence that has been done to show that there's something distinct between the gray matter and all the various locations in our brain and something that you and I would call mind. And I believe that's a biblical concept as well. The Bible talks about the mind and the soul and so forth. So those are the 2 things we'll look at in 4 weeks. So read that lesson if you can. Thank you for your attention.